Hope everyone's having a good morning. Glad to see y'all again. I always enjoy coming out to farmers market to teach the classes. I'm sure many of you have figured out by now that I do a lot of them, and I'm here frequently. My name is Richard Lee. I am a certified master gardener. I work pretty heavily with the association and enjoy teaching a ton. This last year I've served as the association's president. Today I'm going to be talking about intensive gardening. We're going to be discussing a whole bunch of different techniques to make sure that you're getting the absolute most out of your gardening space that you can. I'm always appreciative of questions. The more y'all ask, the better I feel I've done, and the more I feel I've actually taught you. Because if you're asking me things, that means I'm getting you thinking. So that always makes me a lot happier and winds up covering a lot of stuff I may have forgotten about. Because there is a bunch of things to cover. I'm going to wind up treating this presentation more like a 200 level class. I'm not going to go over a lot of the more basic stuff. If for some reason you can't hear me while I'm talking, do flag me down. I will speak up as best I can. I try to talk loud in these, but I don't like yelling if I don't have to. I get to do that enough at work. Let's see, we still got a couple more folks coming in. All right. So, does anybody have any preconceived notions about what intensive gardening might be? Anybody? No? Okay. Well, sometimes when you hear about intensive gardening, you might think that it's like this right here. Going out in the yard, doing a whole bunch of work, getting angry about it, just tearing things up and getting plants in the ground. In reality, it's a lot more like this. Trying to get things organized, doing a lot of planning, and doing some labor, because anytime you're dealing with gardening, you've got to put into that sweat equity to get stuff running. Intensive gardening is just several different techniques that you use to harvest the most possible produce out of your space by doing proper research on cultivars, making sure you're optimizing your plant spacing, and planning to pull stuff out as some things die off to plant more plants later. The benefits of intensive gardening are many. You get to minimize the space that is wasted. If you have a smaller space, you can get a lot more use out of it. You concentrate your work efforts. It's much simpler to maintain a 10 by 12 bed or a couple of 3 by 4s than it is to try and maintain a 40 by 50 plot. You're also not losing any space to walkways in between things, because a lot of time when we're talking intensive gardening, we're talking smaller spaces and mounting things together. That way all your organic material and fertilizer and water is going into one spot. You can create an ideal plant environment. If you have all of your organic material in place, you have a lot of plants kind of shading each other, providing a little bit of natural mulching from the leaf material. The ground stays cooler, stays a little more moist, means it stays more aerable because you're not having to step on as much soil to maintain it. Keeps everything a lot looser, so the plants can grow a lot healthier and a lot faster, and the roots don't have to contend with digging through our wonderful compacted clay soil here. You get better yields with less labor because you have more plants in one space. Because one of the big things with intensive gardening is literally just shoving as much as you can with the plant's growth patterns as possible into one small area. Fewer weeds. If the plants are almost crowding each other out and they're still growing, there's no room really left for weeds. My wife and I got to test this out firsthand last year with the raised beds that we did. Beginning of the year, plants are coming up. They're still on the smaller side. We're out there. We're having to weed every 3 or 4 days. We kind of let things go by midsummer. The cool thing was, though, the plants were large enough and shading the ground out enough that we had very, very few weeds come up. Most of our problems came in the form of crabgrass and Bermuda that tried creeping in from the sides. You can't keep that stuff down with anything less than a blowtorch. Something's growing in every part of the garden at all times during the growing seasons. Here in Middle Tennessee, we do enjoy 3 growing seasons. We can plant in the spring, we can plant stuff in the summer, we can plant stuff for the fall, and depending on how bad the winter is, we can even plan on stuff to grow through there. So we have a lot of opportunity. Intensive gardening techniques allows us to just ramp up those opportunities and have more stuff growing in those spaces all throughout the year. And finally, if you have limited garden space for some reason, again, it is a great way to make use of that. If perhaps you can't maintain large swaths of garden, it's much better for you because, again, you're working in a smaller area, easier to maintain. You can even bring it up closer to the house so that you can work on it a little bit easier. It's a lot simpler to walk 15, 20 foot out the back door than it is to walk half a football field to take care of the garden. With all things, though, there are drawbacks. There's some downsides. It can look messy. A good intensive gardening with lots of succession planting and intercropping will take and look like a giant jumble of green growth that has fruit spaced in between it. You won't really see a lot of real long straight rows. It'll just usually be small blocks of things, or really, really packed, wide, like 3 foot wide rows that you've got some walk space in between. Hand or hand tool weeding. This is one thing you have to do if you're doing these techniques because there's so many plants in one place, you're not getting the tiller in there to take out any of the weeds. You have to get in there by hand to pull them out. Or if you have a little weeding tool, those make life real simple. You can use little aeration tools, but a good old hand cultivator, just a little weed pull, they can make a big difference on getting those weeds out. It's a drawn out process of both planting and harvesting because we're usually doing this over many, many months. Most of us, whenever we garden, we put everything in May, and we start expecting to see stuff pop out of the ground come into June. And then for a lot of us, by the time that stuff runs its course by August, we're pretty much, okay, well, we'll take and tear the garden down later and we'll get ready for next year. But doing these techniques, you usually start in like February, depending on what you're doing, and you will literally be able to plant and harvest stuff all the way through December. So you're just constantly putting things in and taking things out, just rolling stuff over. Really thorough planning is necessary for this because the more planning you do, the better everything will go. You must be very diligent in maintaining your plantings because getting them started right is very key to keeping them running throughout the rest of the year. Initially, it's very labor intensive. It can be very costly because one of the big things with intensive gardening is usually setting up some sort of raised bed that requires a lot of initial work to get going. Most of the time, if you're building what most of us think was a raised bed where you have like some sort of structure holding in soil, that's a one-time investment. And that's a one-time major labor investment. From there on, you're just putting in extra soil. But there are other types of raised bed gardening where you have your standard big plot garden. You're just going through and pulling the soil together to make 3 foot wide rows. They're just big mounds. It's also one of those things that if you do not, I can't stress the planning part enough, because if you do not plan these out and stick to it, you will not have as good of a success as you would like. It's very important to make sure whenever you're doing this kind of gardening that you stay really on top of going and following through everything. So intensive gardening, it encompasses a lot of different techniques. You've got intercropping, you've got relay planting, you have succession planting, you have companion planting, there's vertical gardening. You can even use the same information for doing container gardening on the back porch. It's really a very interdisciplinary thing. And it even includes a lot of different stuff about your botany. Interrelationships of how the plants behave, their growing spaces, growing times, what growing mediums they prefer, what does best in what seasons. All those things play a part as you're going through, you're doing your planning process. You have to keep an eye on those to make sure that you're paying attention to how all this stuff interconnects. So, a bunch of different techniques that are wind up all being encompassed in order to really get going on intensive gardening. Relay planting is probably one of the simplest one of these. All you're doing for relay planting is you're planting different plants So you either take the same crop and plant it, and then 2 weeks later plant the next one, and then 2 weeks later plant the next one, or you're planting crops that have different maturity rates. So if we were talking tomatoes, you put out early girls, which are usually 60, 70-ish days. You can put out some beefsteaks that usually do 70 to 80. Then you can do some Cherokee purples that can take up to 90 days to mature. Set them out in between, and that gives you a relay planting where you have different vegetables maturing at different times. This really plays in making sure you're watching your varieties and what they do. Staggered plantings, again, we're planting rows or groups of the same crop in 2 to 4 week intervals. During the spring, it's very important to make sure you're allowing for those cooler temperatures, because as you're going through, it takes longer for a plant to start in the spring because the soil is cooler. So you want to make sure you have that allowance. There are some things like corn that if you plant several different varieties, the cross-pollination of them can actually interfere with their development. So if you have an early, a mid, and a late season corn and they're all tasseling at the same time and cross-pollinating, your ears may not have as many developed kernels on them, so that's something else to watch out for. Once the plants start flagging, go ahead and pull them out. There's no reason to take and leave a plant that is no longer producing in the ground. It's one of those things that's really hard to do because it's like, I've grown this for 3 months now. It's got to come out. No, I can't pull it out. You just have to get in there, down at the bottom, and rip it up. When you go throw it in the compost pile so it can break down, you can just put it back in your soil liquor. In the fall, you have to pay attention to your frost dates because you want your last crops to mature before that frost, or at least be significantly hardened off. This is actually the same formula I use for my fall gardening class. If y'all are here for that, some of you have already seen this. But what you do is you find your average first frost date. Here in our portion of Middle Tennessee, it says October 15th. I remember it is October 14th because that's my anniversary. You then take your days to maturity for your plant. We'll say that this is a type of bean. 50 days is pretty normal for beans to mature. So you add 10 days. You add a little extra time in there to account for the sun going down, nights being a little bit longer, things being a little bit cooler. It takes time for those plants to get running faster. So you add all that together. So we take 60 and we subtract that from October 15th. So we start counting back 2 months. We count back 2 months. That means on this variety of beans, the last set of it we can put out and expect it to be at least cold hardy and preferably ready is August 15th, which means 3 days ago if we were to do it this way. You got a little bit of leeway because weather is always a weird thing here. We're always doing different kinds of things with our temperatures. Just play with it, see how it goes. I'll be talking about gardening journals later. That's an excellent thing to keep up with because you really want to have a good feeling for what your weather's going to do. And always do multiple different planting stuff if possible. That way you have a good shot at hitting all those necessary intervals. Some good examples of staggered plantings: arugula, basil, beans, kale, kohlrabi, rutabaga, radish, Swiss chard. Pretty much any plant that has a peak season where it hits its maximum production level and then falls off is good for staggered plantings. Now you can just kind of keep that rolling in. Here you can see an example of beans that have been staggered out. We've got some that are probably about a week or so old, another row that's probably about 3 weeks old, and then these beans are probably about a month, month and a half. Then we have planting the same vegetables but different maturity rates. There's all different maturity rates for all different kinds of vegetable plants. If there's a vegetable plant, there's at least 3 different times that it matures, all across the board. On your packets, they'll always have on the back days to maturity. I have an example of that later. Just look for that and that'll tell you how long out to expect it. If you're getting transplants, that day's maturity is from transplanting time. So from the day you set it out, in the case of an early girl, 70 days later, you'll wind up usually having a vegetable. Sometimes you can get it earlier because you maybe transplanted it in right and got it going really well. So you can buy maybe 5, 6, 7 days extra. Really good things for this staggered planting is tomatoes. lettuce, beans, carrots, summer squash. Winter squash is great to follow after summer squash. And that brings us to succession planting. Succession planting is just going through and as a crop finishes up, replacing it with a completely different one. So in the spring, you plant yourself some nice big heads of broccoli out to take a pull in. Once you pull all those up, you go in there, you put in some beans. And then in the fall, once the beans are finished off, you go in and you plant you some leaf greens. That right there is some wonderful little oak leaf lettuce. Oak leaf lettuce is great for our area because it's really resistant to bolting. It holds up against the heat really well. So for this part, it's really important to more or less just focus on planting a spring, summer, and fall garden. It's the easiest way to make this happen. And then you can even work in the relay planting with this, because you can take and start pulling out the broccoli that you put out in different weeks, and then swap over to planting beans as you pull out that first run, and it just keeps pulling you through the rest of the year. Intercropping. Has anyone here ever heard of intercropping? You've probably seen it done if you haven't heard about it. It's a super simple old way of doing intensive gardening. You just take one crop that matures later or slower than another one, and you plant a quicker growing variety of crop in between it. So in this picture here, you have corn, and in between the corn, in this example, you've got some clover coming up. That serves two purposes. One, the clover keeps the soil there until the corn can get up to good size. Clover also takes and adds nitrogen to the soil. You can swap that out with bush beans. They'll do the same thing. They come up really fast. They add nitrogen to the soil. They help suppress the weeds. Over here, we've got a garden that I had. This is some English sweet peas right here. And in between, we've got some okra that's starting to come up where I've just swapped some stuff out. Because those peas, if they're doing really well, they can go to, you really want your okra to start in June. This greatly increases productivity even beyond the staggered and succession planting, because you're finally starting to make use of that same spot for multiple vegetables at the same time. So we're slowly getting more complicated as we're going through this. This is another garden bed of mine at the house last year. I have two different varieties of corn in here, and in between I've got three different varieties of beans. Now, I made a terrible error whenever I did this. I planted pole beans in my corn. Great idea in theory, yeah. The problem you run into is that corn has a really good, stable base to it, but you don't get in a raised bed this young. They don't have enough strength to hold up the pole beans. We actually had just a big lodgepole mess in there by the end of summer, where everything had just laid over from a windstorm that came through. Managed to get most of it standing back upright, but it was a mess. The beans did fine though, because beans are tough. And then here on the edges, we have squash and zucchini coming up. Now, this right here is very reminiscent of an old gardening technique here in the Americas that is called Three Sisters. If you've never heard of that, it's an Indian gardening technique where they would take and plant corn, beans, and squash together. The squash, big leaves, shades out the soil, helps trap moisture. More importantly, keeps the weeds at bay. Because if the weeds don't have sunlight, they don't germinate and keep growing well. The beans, constantly feeding that nitrogen back into the soil. The corn gives them a place to take and crawl around on, holds everything together. Another benefit of the squash is hairy, isn't it? You know what likes getting into corn that's hairy? Raccoons. Raccoons do not like the feeling those bristles from the squash and cucumbers on their hands, so they won't go into that patch as much. It's a great little trick to sort of help weed them out. Not to mention, if it's that thick in there, they don't want to go messing around in there. They'll get tangled up and someone will come through and eat them. But again, and this is a very small set for corn. It's a hard thing to do this way in a raised bed, unless it's a big raised bed or you're really dedicated to it. A fellow by the name of Mark Murphy, I don't know if any of y'all have seen him. He's done corn in raised beds for a while. He does a really good job of it. He grows very small varieties that produce very heavily and are very stout. And that's what you need for doing this. These varieties are Golden Bantam and Blue Jade. The Blue Jade held up a lot better than the Golden Bantam. That Blue Jade is a blue corn kernel. It's grown to be nice drought tolerant and have a fairly quick maturity season. Okay, so intercropping, just combining different crops with growth rates and maturity rates. Some good examples. We talked about corns and beans. You can plant peppers and spinach or peppers and cilantro if you like salsa. Arugula followed by leeks. Baby salad greens and onions are good for intercropping because they come up at different times. Radishes and broccoli and cauliflower. Broccoli, it takes about 60 days to come up and mature. Radishes, I've seen those little suckers come up in 3 days. I've seen them start swelling up to be edible within a week and a half to 2 weeks. So as those radishes come up, you can start thinning them out, and that gives more room for the broccoli as you're going through. So it's just swapping things out again. That's a lot of what this is. And those topics framed us to companion planting, which is one of my favorite topics whenever it comes to gardening, because you not only can make really pretty garden beds with it, they have a lot of benefits. You're usually looking to grow plants together that complement each other or provide some sort of benefit to one another. It's really important to understanding how plants interact, because if you get companion planting down, it makes figuring out what varieties to put with whom work a lot better and easier. Many of these plants provide a little layer of defense against diseases and pests. There's a few other benefits you'll find in companion planting. It's also handy to know if the plant that you're putting in there is going to have a detrimental effect on the plant that you're wanting. Like, you don't want to plant any sort of onion or garlic in with your beans. Anyone want to take a shot at why? Anybody?
Would it be the taste?
Can be the taste a little bit, but more it's nitrogen fixation in beans, which they depend on, comes from bacteria. Onions, garlic, all the different members of the allium family, they can deter bacterial growth. So if you got your onions and your garlic and your chives planted in with your beans, keep them from growing as well. Some things like marigolds, and there's two different types of marigolds, if you didn't know, whenever we're talking about marigolds. There's African marigolds, which are these right here, and then there's calendula, or pot marigold. African marigolds are great for nematodes. If you're wanting to deter insects, you want pot marigold, calendula. That's where a lot of people get in trouble. They go like, I planted marigolds with my plants. Why do I keep getting aphids? It's because the African marigolds are keeping the nematodes down off your tomato plants. They're not doing anything for the aphids. They might have a nice small spot where the aphids can go eat first. It may attract some bugs that'll eat the aphids. In here, we've got a couple different types of leaf greens all planted together. One of my favorite things to plant is carrots, onions, and lettuce kind of together. Carrots will kind of provide a little bit of screening from the onions for onion flies. Onions will provide some screening for the carrots against carrot flies. And they'll both kind of deter some of the cabbage moths and other stuff that will get on your leaf greens. There's lots of good information online about companion planting. One of my favorite sites to go to is mysquarefootgarden.net. I've got a slide with all those websites here at the end. She's got a nice Excel spreadsheet laid out in there where you can take and choose a plant and choose another plant, and they'll tell you if they work well together and what other plants will work with. Some things, among the other benefits, some of this stuff hasn't really been looked into by extension, but I've known that and heard that if you plant yarrow, which is a small, real pretty flower, several varieties are native here in Tennessee, with your herbs, it can improve the taste of the herbs. It also has the benefit of drawing in beneficial insects and parasitic wasps to keep the bad bugs off your plants. Raised beds. Yes, ma'am.
How does a plant get enough nutrients planted that close together? Because most everything says plant them this far apart.
A lot of the time, whenever you're looking at the plant packet, you have two measurements. So this will wind up being a two-part question. Whenever you look at that packet, you have in-row spacing, and then you have row spacing. That row spacing is usually there to account for us being able to walk in between them. So if you're planting out pepper plants, they might have on there plant them 24 inches to 3 feet between rows, but that in-row spacing is usually between a foot, foot and a half. So you can actually shove plants a lot closer than what we're used to. And then the nutrient part is whenever you're doing your planting in the spring, you're going in there, you're making sure you're tilling in a lot of organic matter. As you're going throughout the summer and you're replacing plants, you're also at that point then putting in more compost. So you're constantly feeding the soil more and more. Because whenever you're talking about gardening and making sure that everything is healthy, you really start at the soil. Because as long as that soil is good and healthy and rich, and all the microbial life is doing what it's supposed to, the plants will be taken care of. Because that soil is like its house. As long as that house is in order and kept clean and good and well supplied, everything that lives in it will be happy and healthy. It'll even keep down a lot of your pest issues. Because the more active and positive that ground is with beneficial organisms from where you've been feeding it all year, the more it'll deter other stuff that might build up that can cause problems. So you're just constantly making sure you're mixing in more and more organic material and even just standard fertilizers sometimes as you need to keep everything running real heavily and well.
Standard being 10, 10, 10?
10, 10, 10. I prefer with vegetable gardening like lower nitrogen numbers like 5, 10, 10, something in those ratios. And the slower release the fertilizer is, the better. So those granules that are slow release, you can usually get them as like, oh, it escapes me right now. Comes in a little shaker can, Osmocote. I personally love Espona's fertilizers because they're made from chicken manure and they're fortified with other fun things. Espona. They're the producers of Hollytone, if you've ever heard of it. They also produce one of my favorite inoculating fertilizers called Biotone. Their Starter Plus formula not only has a bunch of beneficial soil bacteria, but has beneficial soil fungi called mycorrhizal fungi. And now I go off on a tangent. Those little guys are really impressive to me every time I think about them because they're hair-thin fungi. They wrap on the plant roots. Some of them just get into the vascular tissue, so the veins of the plant. Others will dig all the way down to the cells. Their sole existence and purpose in life is at that point, once they're attached, to run out to the tune of 3 foot a minute during the growing season, find water and nutrient material, and shove it straight back to the plant. The only thing that they want is a little sugar. I've seen slides where a strand of mycorrhizal fungi has found a nematode, wrapped it up, and completely consumed it in a minute. They can go that fast. They'll improve the root mass of a plant through their presence anywhere between 4 to 100 times. And they make a habit of seeking out distressed plants to make them do better. And once you get them into your garden and into your yard, unless you're doing a lot of heavy tilling or you're applying a lot of chemicals, they will stay there and they will start multiplying. So it's really good to start getting them in there. Had a fellow a few years ago who worked with me, he tried out an experiment on his yard. This was 4 years ago now, super, super hot summer. He fertilized a spot in his yard with some mycorrhizae heavy fertilizer. Put that out on there. He left another spot where he just fertilized it normal. He moved out of the house by the end of July. Throughout all of August, his buddy who moved in the house after him kept calling him up, chewing him out, because he was having to, through that heat, mow that grass 2 times a week. Because that mycorrhizal fungi was in there finding all the water in the yard and shoving it to the grass. So it's really, really important to make sure that you're taking care of your soil. It's actually one of my next slides in here. The more soil preparation you do, the more organic material you'll work in, the healthier you make that ground, the better it's going to do for you, the harder it's going to produce.
So you gotta be a composter to do this,
It helps significantly.
or can you buy composted soil?
You can buy composted soil and put it in, because you usually don't have to do too much. You just have to add enough to make up for what the plants pulled out. And you even as you can pull plants up, who all here knows what a digging fork is? A digging fork? Okay, everyone knows what a pitchfork is, right?
Yes.
Okay, a digging fork is a short pitchfork with stouter tines.
Oh, yes.
A lot of us have used it to pull potatoes out of the ground. You take it, just set it down in the soil, step off on it, and you can raise it back, and it just kind of pulls the soil up. It's great around here for loosening our ground because it just does it in little bits. Whenever we're doing rain garden out there, I use one of those to just tear that soil apart so we can get compost mixed in.
It's called a what?
A digging fork.
Just digging for it.
Mm-hmm. You can take one of those, put it down underneath it, pop the plant up, have your hose there, rinse the soil off the roots, and then just usually put a scoop of compost back in and you're fine.
Okay, I'm fairly new at this, but I grew up on a farm, so, do you wanna dig down into the clay soil that we have here, or do you just wanna start on top of that clay soil and build?
I'm a big fan of leaving our clay alone.
Okay. I think that's a mistake.
It's actually really easy to start improving clay soil because it's very accepting of nutrient material once you get it in there. The easiest way to construct a raised bed is to take and figure out where you're going to put the bed. Take you a weed eater, go through there and just scalp the daylights out of that soil. Just get rid of all that green material that's right there, because there's always some sort of grass or weed that's out there whenever we're trying to put this stuff in. You can spray it if you want to with Roundup or something, or you can take a blowtorch to it and burn it off that way. You can really make sure you kill the top of that weed air zone. But the next thing you do is you get you some cardboard or some paper feed bags, and you lay that down, and you put your form material, whatever you're using to build your bed's frame, on top of that. Then you start throwing in your soil mix, which can be anywhere between just some loose compost mixed with pine fines or straw. Could be a little bit of native topsoil. Maybe you got lucky and you have some bottomland on your ground that you have access to, so you found like one of 2 places in Tennessee that has black soil. And you put that in there, and then you plant all your stuff in there. There's even different ways to do that. There's lasagna gardening, where you go through and you mix different types of materials together to do in-bed composting. There is a type of composting I'm even going to try to pronounce because I butcher it every single time, but it involves stacking wood, topsoil, and compost all together. That wood absorbs water and releases it real slowly into the surrounding soil mix and allows the plants to pull it out as they need it. And as it breaks down, it makes you a very good, rich, loamy soil. So you can get away with not having to compost. You definitely want to get away with not having to dig down into our soil. And one of the things is that you keep adding all that stuff in and you keep your bed watered, you start washing some humic acid out of all that stuff you've been putting in the bed. As that humic acid trickles down, it starts digging into that clay and it starts breaking it up. That's why we used cardboard and the heavy paper whenever we started doing this, because as that humic acid builds down and starts loosening that soil, then earthworms can start digging down into that soil. They start loosening it up more. If you've been keeping your soil bacterially heavy and heavy with a bunch of different other beneficial organisms like mycorrhizal fungi, it'll start digging down and breaking that soil up. So by building on top of the ground and making sure you've got in your little raised bed, however big you decide to build it, you wind up eventually making a deeper soil layer, because all the excess nutrients the plants can't take up and the soil microbes can't deal with starts digging down and affecting the soil underneath. So you wind up with a better bed area just leaving the clay alone. Now in places where the ground's easier to dig, you do double digging, which I've done. It's a great way to get a workout, and it really brings the intensive into gardening. Because you take 12 inches of soil, put it to the side, and then you take another 12 inches of soil and you flip it over to where you just dug up the first 12 inches.
Back to, I'd love for you to spell that amazing
Mycorrhizal
Yeah.
fungi? Oh, this will be fun.
Is there a common name for that?
No.
No. Myco, M-Y-C-O, this is going to get you just close enough for a search. R-H-I-Z-E-A-L, that will get you really, really close.
And what source do you have for that?
If you've ever shopped where I work, which is South Branch Nursery, all of their material, all their plant material that we get from Monrovia has 13 different types of mycorrhizal fungi in there. Used to, whenever they sold the fertilizer, they had it in there as well. Now, pretty much limited to Espoma's Biotone Starter Plus, and we just started carrying Fox Farm products. Some of their soil and fertilizer mixes have mycorrhizal fungi in there. And all of these different companies have different varieties of mycorrhizal fungi. So the more of it you can throw in there, the more different varieties you have, which means you have an even better chance of getting one that will stick in your yard and stick to your plants.
Can't believe I didn't make that association. It's been so helpful to me. But I did the lasagna garden without the raised sides on it. And it's been about 4 years, and it's now amazing when I do potatoes. It's just, it's just a different world.
And that's a really good way too to take and start your first raised bed is doing potatoes. We don't even bother digging into the ground, we just kill off the grass. Then you put your potatoes just barely into the soil, and you put the compost and a little straw over top of the potatoes. As you see the potatoes come up and start laying out, you throw more compost and straw in on top of them. And you just repeat that process until they get usually about 2 to 3 foot tall mounds. And then you just let them run wild. And you go in there once they start yellowing out, and you dig your potatoes. And you'll have potatoes all through there.
I also did the wood for the strawberry bed, and it was great.
You mentioned the chicken manure. Do you just take a small tiller and that fork and just mix it into your soil?
If you're using chicken manure, make sure it's real heavily composted, because chicken manure's got a lot of water-soluble nitrogen in there. It'll burn a plant up in a heartbeat. The good thing about Espoma's stuff is that chicken manure's also got a lot of supplemental nutrients in there that's really good. Their stuff's been sitting in composting for several years, or they put it through a process where it breaks down super fast because they're adding a lot of bacteria in there. So you just, if you're using the fertilizer, you just mix it in like you do normal fertilizer. You're doing your side dressing and your little bit in there as you're planting. If you're doing a large bed, or you're doing your garden, or you're doing your raised beds, you'll go through there in the spring, lay out 3 or 4 inches, and just kind of take it, mix it in. You can use a rototiller to do that in larger beds. And a raised bed, you can just take your digging fork and just turn it over, and then just plant straight down. Just always make sure if you're using manure of any sort that it's composted really well. Usually want to at least go through 2 or 3 seasons of weather exposure before you try using it, or mix it in with your compost pile, because that'll make everything just ramp up the cooking faster and make it break down really quickly. A lot of this we've already talked about. We're going through. Raised bed garden usually forces you into planting stuff in bands that overlap. As I try killing the clicker. There we go. Having this overlapping, not only does it reduce weeds, it also increases soil moisture. 3 to 4 foot. Do us all a favor and don't make your raised beds wider than 3 to 4 foot, because you really just want to be able to just simply reach in from both sides. Now go hog wild, make them as long as you want to. You can have 50, 70 foot long raised beds because you can work it from both sides. But for everyone's sake, including your own, just 3 to 4 foot, just far enough where you can reach in with your hand comfortably, makes it a lot easier. Real big benefit of raised beds, having that soil up out of that nice cold clay in the spring makes it warm up a lot faster. It makes it dry quicker so you can plant sooner. Square foot gardening, this is quite possibly one of the coolest gardening techniques I've discovered since I started working at the nursery. This combines pretty much everything we've been talking about. Because in square foot gardening, you're doing intercropping, you're doing companion planting. Your stuff comes out of season, you're putting more stuff back in, and you're being very particular about where you're placing everything and what you shove in next to each other. It's got a very handy book. There are lots of websites that talk about it and give you directions on how far to space plants. The fellow who wrote the book, Mel Bartholomew, he wrote Square Foot Gardening. His beds are 4 inches tall. Now, I like not having to water stuff necessarily every single day, so I usually tell people 6 to 8 inches. Gives you a little bit better soil depth. You want to plant something that's taller, you can put that in there. Also gives you room to bury your tomato plants so you got better roots on them. It's real easy to learn once you get started into it, especially if you got that nice book or just print out of stuff from one of the websites. Awesome for tight yards. You can shove a lot of stuff into that space. This is my favorite go-to for gardening now to help people learn how to make the absolute most out of their area. And you wind up getting exposing yourself to all these other techniques of intensive gardening just by looking at this. Now, the one thing on doing these boxes is the soil gets really expensive. And I use soil very, very loosely because if you're doing this the way he says, you're making a soilless mix. There's no soil in there. Soil consists of clay, silt, and sand. The only thing that goes into these beds is compost, vermiculite, and peat moss. So you have a fast draining, nutrient heavy mix that allow for a lot of airflow in there. It makes for very healthy plant roots, which makes for very healthy plants. Soil preparation. I cannot stress this enough. We've talked about it pretty good so far, but feeding that ground makes the plant a lot healthier. Do your soil testing, even if you're doing a raised bed every couple of years, pull your soil test out, see how everything sits. Raised beds can run through nutrients even faster, so sometimes it benefits you to pull those tests every fall. Because just like in containers when we're watering them, we flush stuff through really quickly, so that can change the pH and the nutrient levels really fast. The more organic material you can do, the better. Double digging, I recommend avoiding that year unless you have to, or you're putting in a rain garden. Whenever you go to prep your ground, if you're doing any sort of raised bed as part of a traditional plot garden, make sure when you go to turn that soil that it is loose. You don't want it real clumpy and cloddy. You also don't want it like powder. There's a real small line where it's just the right consistency. You can pick it up out of the ground, just kind of roll it around a little bit, and it'll just fall to pieces. You want it at that consistency before you run a tiller through there. Because otherwise you're picking clods up out of the yard, out of the garden all the rest of the year, or you're destroying the soil layer and the wind just gets to pick it up and make a new dust bowl. Cover cropping is important. If you're not doing a lot of successional planting, just go in there and put something that's really easy to kill or that you might want through the winter. Turnips are great cover crops. They're cheap to get. The seeds come up real fast. They cover the ground and hold all the soil there. You can eat the greens, you can eat the turnips. You can take and mulch everything up and turn it in and it'll feed the soil. I'm a big fan of red clover. Our summer usually starts killing it out, so you don't have to worry about it. You just take and turn it over in the bed and you're good to go. A soil test may tell you to put lime or sulfur into your ground. You want to do that in the fall going into winter. It'll mix into the soil a lot better that way. Always clean up your garden, get all that dead plant material out of there, especially diseased material, because the sooner you pull that out, the better off your garden's going to be because it's not going to be stressed. Fertilizer, you may wind up having to add some traditional fertilizers in there, but if you're putting in as much compost as you really want to be, you shouldn't have to add too much stuff. Spacing is very important. Always check your packaging. It'll tell you how much distance you can put stuff between things. Some of the things are really tight. Lettuces, you can shove 16 of those plants into a square foot. Squash, you need about 3 feet for. There is a trick where you can take and run them up a tomato cage and have them take up about 1.5 feet. but you have to make sure you got them running just straight up the cage. Same thing goes for cucumbers. That's where we start talking about vertical gardening, running stuff up. Some things we think about doing that, like beans, tomatoes. Some things we don't think about doing that way, like squash, cantaloupe, muskmelon. You can run cucumbers, do wonderful on trellises. To determine your spacing for intercropping, so if we're just doing two things together, you'll take and add together how far apart they're supposed to be. So in this example, we're talking about beans and radishes. So you've got a 2-inch spacing and a 4-inch spacing. You add that together, that gives you 6-inch spacings. We're talking about 2 plants, so we'll then divide that by 2. So that means they go on 3-inch centers as you're putting them down through there. So you want them spaced out. If you're not doing square foot gardening where you're keeping to that grid, you usually want to do a staggered seed planting where plants are going in between each other. That lets you maximize your space. That way everybody's got that equidistant room that they need. Planting. We've talked a lot about techniques. Planning is super important in all of this. If you do not plan, you do plan to fail, to both the guys on the at-home show. You should start your planning no later than January because there's some stuff you can put out in February. One of the handouts y'all got is something I hand out at the nursery a lot. In there, it's got a bunch of tables. One of those tables is for spring plantings. If you'll notice, there's probably about half of that table that you can start putting out in February. So knowing what you're doing, at least going into January, is a big, big help. That way you can start getting that process rolling. That's one of the reasons why I like having this class right now, because y'all can start thinking about all this stuff and start working it in for next year's garden. Review what you've grown, and something I cannot stress enough, plant what you eat. If you do not plant what you eat, you will not eat what you plant. It sounds simple, but tons of people do it. It's like, I want to grow watermelon. There's one person in the family that grows watermelon, and you just took up about 8 foot of your garden. Lay out your beds, make a planting schedule, get all your necessary materials gathered whenever you're doing your planting. Keep a gardening journal. They're awesome. It's a big collection of all the information you really, really want for this process. Get that soil test done. And then an important consideration for all of this is the economic value of your plant material. Some things are more feasible to go through this much trouble to plant than others. That intensive gardening handout they've got has a page in there. It's the second page where it's got a little list of vegetables in economic value, the top 15. So these are plants that if you were to go to the grocery store, the amount you'd usually pay for what you use through the season is greater than the effort and money you put in doing these techniques. So it's really good and valuable to grow them this way. I mean, de facto tomatoes, I don't buy tomatoes usually. I eat them very seldomly. My wife loves them. What were they the last time you bought tomatoes?
At Aldi's, this is Aldi's now. It was around $2.
That was a pound. Yeah. Carrots, you can grow a ton of carrots in a small space. And if they're in the ground, you can usually just leave them there and pull them up as you need them. So you don't have to constantly run to the store, pull them out. There's great ways to store them for several months at a time. Whenever you do grow them out.
They won't rot in the summer?
If you got them in a cooler place, you can leave them in the ground usually for the first half of summer and pull them out as you need to. But once it starts getting really hot, you see those leaves start wilting back, go ahead and pull them, and you can store them in a root cellar method. A very simple one is to take your tote, put you down a thin layer of sand, take your spritz bottle and just lightly spritz that sand, lay your carrots down so they're interlocked, then put you another little bit of sand, enough to cover up that first bit of carrots, spritz it again, and then just repeat that process. Don't put the lid on because you don't want to trap the moisture in there too much. You don't want to lock down or just lay it over. slide off into a dark corner. You can pull those carrots out until they start rotting in about 3 or 4 months. And or they start pushing out new green growth once you get them to the light, because they'll do that too.
My best carrots have always been planted in the fall, because it just.
Yeah, they've got a lot more time. It's cooler, it's nicer. Early spring and then late summer for fall gardening, and they'll keep with good mulching through to Christmas usually in the soil, and you can pull them up and store them. Broccoli florets can be very costly. You can take and grow a whole bunch of them in the fall, freeze those suckers, and you have them for the next rest of the year. Planting plants. Do not be terrified by this. This right here is something I did for our garden. You can see that it's real simple. I just have whenever I put them out and then when they have to come out. So for the spinach, I've got 2 runs of it to account for its growing season in the spring. Put in some in February, put in some in March. The ones I put in February, they're ready to come out by April. The ones I put in March, they're ready to come out by May. You can put another run in there if you wanted to, and if it's a real heat-hardy variety, which you want to probably switch to if you're planting out in April or May, an additional bit, you can probably still pull them into June. But with this, I've got them laid out, so as I pull up that spinach, I can swap over to squash, and then I can swap back up to spinach. With my beans, put in my first run of beans in April, and I just keep swapping them out like every month and a half throughout the entire summer. The carrots, you got 2 good runs of them. You can swap them out with something else. Your first run of carrots, you take and put in May, pull them out in June. So we're putting in peppers, a run of peppers in June, so you can swap those out. That's a good alternating crop to do. So it's just figuring out what you want to plant, figuring out how long it takes to mature, and then mixing and matching stuff, playing plant Jenga until it all fits together. And you can make really detailed notes. And you also want to make sure you got your layouts going. So you'd have like a spring garden layout, a summer garden layout, and a fall garden layout. And then you'd have your planting plan for whenever you would set things out in the garden. And you just follow all that as best as you can and the weather allows. Garden journals. Some of our earliest documentation for many of our presidents, especially Thomas Jefferson and George Washington, is their garden journals. This is where they would record everything about their day, weather, what happened, what pests had been bothering them, what they harvested, what they planted out, what varieties they did, when did they fertilize, how much they got off of their crop yields. All this information is really good once you get into intensive gardening to make sure you're accounting for what varieties do best in your area and best in your yard that you like to eat the best. And there's a whole bunch of different ones of these you can find. You can even just make a Word document and record all this stuff in there. Seed labels, I was talking about those earlier. It won't show up. Step out of camera for a second. But here you have your spacing, telling you 2 inches apart. Normally beans you'll plant on 2 to 3 foot rows, but if you're doing square foot gardening or you're doing intercropping, you'll be able to get them a lot closer. Square foot gardening, you can usually put 8 beans to 1 square foot and just have them grow up a trellis. Bush beans, it gets a little messier, but you can still do the same amount. But all the information you need to determine how you're planting everything out is on this page, and most of it rests in that in-row planting, because that is the absolute minimum you can shove plants together. Crop rotation, I mentioned a little bit about that. This is really important primarily to reduce disease in your garden. You do not want to plant corn in the same place year after year, because not only does it encourage all different types of silkworm and whatnot to show up, it also depletes the soil of nitrogen and won't grow other plants as well. So you swap them out with something from another family, hopefully something that puts in a lot more nitrogen, like beans, legumes, or goosefoot. If you've never seen them, they're a fun little thing. And there's just different groups. You have vines, you have brassicas, you have squashes, you got corn, you got peppers and tomatoes, which make up their own family and have their own diseases they deal with. Big thing to remember is just do not plant the same plant type in the same spot year after year. Move something else into there.
So if you have tomatoes, can you plant them at one end one year and then plant them at the other end the other year?
Yeah, you can just swap them out that way, and a raised bed works out real well because you're adding in so much new soil every year from the compost that you have a lot better turnover. In a plot garden, you're best kind of just shifting them through. Like my grandfather, one year the tomatoes would be way over here, 50 foot from where they were a couple of years ago, and then they just start going through every year.
Aren't you supposed to do a 3-year rotation on tomatoes?
That is best for all of your crops, taking and having them swap through. That way they're not in the same spot 3 years in a row. But an absolute minimum, don't have it in there just year after year. So every other year, absolute minimum. The further the spacing, the better. So the bigger your beds are, the longer they are, the more of them you have, the better your rotation can be. That way, because the best case scenario is to have 3, 5, 6 years between the same plant being in our group of plants being in the same bed. That way you completely get rid of all of those opportunities for those diseases to build up. Because by the time you circle back around, they would have gotten completely out of the soil, because the other plants you put in there and the other nutrient material and the beneficial soil organisms have run them out. Another positive about intercropping that I didn't mention is that the greatest benefit to pest insects is large row farming. It makes it really easy to find what they like to eat. Because it's much easier to find a 50 by 50 patch of tomatoes than it is to find 3 or 4 tomatoes in a row of pepper plants. So that intercropping, it confuses the bug senses of how to find what they're after and what they're wanting to eat on. So that's another big benefit of intercropping, more pest reduction. And the more pest reduction you can get, the less pesticides you can put down, and the less you have to worry about your garden. Some tips for successful intensive planting: make sure you have enough seed and have ordered enough different types of seed to get you through your growing season. Sometimes it can be hard to track down stuff you might need later on in the year. A lot of seed providers run through their available stock by midsummer. If you get to midsummer, you go, oh, I need another 50 pounds of beans. You're probably not going to find another 50 pounds of beans of what you're looking for. Do not be scared to pull out old and dead plants. Go ahead, get rid of them. It is okay. And if you need to, it's okay to prune them back if you need to do that. The only thing you will make a plant do is get as big and mean as the Hulk if you prune on it. If you like starting seeds, go ahead and whenever you finish up one seed starting in the house, start up your next set so you have plants to cycle through real easily. It's much better when you're doing this type of gardening to be able to get stuff kicking and pumping just really, really fast. Shop for varieties of the same crop with different maturity rates. We've already talked about that. Pay attention to what seasons you're planting stuff in. Fall planting, you want varieties that mature faster to account for the fact that temperatures are getting cooler, there's less sunlight. Spring, you can go for varieties that mature slower. Around here, some of those fall plants, you do still want fast maturing varieties in spring. Take as much advantage of the cold we do get as possible. At this point in the year, not so much helpful, but usually around July, check your garden centers. They've usually got vegetable plants anywhere between 25 to 75% off. It is a great time to go in and go rescue some poor long-legged tomato plant and put it out in your garden and get some fruit off of it. And then always plan, lots and lots of planning. Because the more you plan, the more you get stuff put down on paper and you know when stuff is going out and you know when you have to do things, the easier it'll be, because it's like, okay, I've got seeds I need to put out this week. So as soon as you get there, you put them out. This is my list of favorite resources. I'll swap this back over here in a second so y'all can copy those down. MySquareFootGarden.net is my favorite website to go to for square foot gardening information. UT Extension, their Growing Vegetables in the Home Garden publication, is one of the best I've seen on the internet. Their main page will let you search for tons and tons and tons of different publications on every subject you can imagine. And if you can't find something there, go check out the other extensions in the other states. Tennessee's extension does not have a document for intensive gardening, but fortunately for us, Virginia does. Seed Savers is one of my favorite seed producers. They do all heirloom seeds, so these are seeds that if you know how to do seed saving, you can take and get them to propagate for you year after year, so once you buy them, you can have a continual supply of seed. A lot of their seed is also grown organically, so it's certified organic. So what that means, honestly, is that the ground it's been grown in has been certified organic, which means it hasn't had a chemical on it in 10 years. And there wasn't any sort of chemical applied to its parents or to its seed. And that's what makes it organic seed. Good news is their organic seed is the exact same price as their regular heirloom seed. So you don't even pay a premium for it being organic. If you decide to go into fruit-bearing trees, bushes, and vines, Stark Brothers is an excellent website. They were an old paper catalog back in the 1800s, like Sears Roebuck, if anyone remembers those. But now they've gone online and they have a huge selection of everything fruiting that you might want to eat. Thank y'all for listening to me. And, any other questions?